right, and it's 10 after, so I guess I'll get started. So, hi everybody. I'm Mary, and I'm really excited to be here today to be talking to you about editing. So, just a little bit about me to kick things off. So, I am the owner of editing agency Elixir Editorial. It's a business I just started within the last year or so, so it's still early days yet. But I come from a background kind of English and literature and all of that good stuff, years and years of writing myself. So I'm actually an alumna of U of T in English and Classical Civilization, and I'm continuing my professional training through Queen's University and Editors Canada at the moment. Um, and I'm also current programs chair at Editors Toronto. So just to give you a little bit of background about me before we get started. So I will, like I say, I will pause sort of at various points to make sure we scoop up any questions if anybody has any. So feel free to raise your hand virtually or in person if you have any. All right, so before we kind of dive into editing, I figured it was a great way to kind of get us started framing it up with an overview of publishing itself. For those of us who haven't really kind of dived into that just yet. So there's two main streams that you can go with for publishing, obviously. The first is traditional publishing. And this is probably what most people, if you tell them that you're writing a book, are going to be thinking that your next steps are. So the author drafts the manuscript, you revise the manuscript, you might bring in editing help at this time, maybe beta readers, maybe getting feedback from friends, family, or maybe even an editor as well. Sometimes people will hire an editor to help you prepare your manuscript for submission. The author, after that, drafts query letters to solicit publishers, and sometimes you might have help at this stage as well. So you can acquire a literary agent to assist with solicitation. That's its own little process as well. The publishing the publishing industry has changed somewhat dramatically over the last, I'd say, 20, 30 years-ish. And so what happens is that there's kind of that intermediary step now of a literary agent who almost acts as if they were the publisher initially. So publishing companies, sometimes they don't actually take solicitation directly. They want to talk to your literary agent. Um, then after that, your work is kind of done, actually. These are kind of the upfront steps that you have to do to get everything prepared. And then after that, the acquisitions editor, if you are lucky enough to have your manuscript picked up, they send it for further editing rounds to line it up with their own style preferences, things like that. And then they may or may not involve you at that stage, is something else to note. So, creatively speaking, you might not have as much control over that side of things once it gets through to that stage. After that, the publisher is going to facilitate design, proofreading, printing, marketing, distribution, all of that stuff before release. So they will take on the bulk of that work. Now, conversely, if you look at independent publishing, which has become a much bigger part of the industry nowadays, it's much more accessible, especially with the advent of things like Kindle and Amazon being so prolific, other EPUB readers and things like that. A lot of people carry them nowadays. But the first step, of course, remains the same. You have to draft your manuscript. You have to have something to actually publish first. And then after that, I've kind of highlighted these things in the darker colors here, if you can see the slides. You're going to do the next steps entirely yourself, or at least you're going to be directing those steps yourself. So you're going to revise the manuscript. At this stage, you often see authors hiring an editor at this stage to make sure that the material meets a specific standard, because it's not going through that sort of gate of having a publisher look at it, and they're going to have their own editing staff or freelancers that they work with review things. You're going to kind of be that final step, that final approval before it goes up in front of people. So a lot of the time, people will contact somebody to kind of make sure that all of the material is as the best shape it can be before you present it to your audience. After that, you can either do it yourself or you might hire a third party to do all of those things that I mentioned a publisher would do traditionally. So, design, formatting, proofreading, printing, all of the sort of distribution orientated things, marketing, all of that stuff. If you are choosing to go it alone with a lot of these things, the thing to note is that this basically is a full-time job, if not more so. So it's a lot of effort, but I will say the main differences that I sort of understand about these two different streams is that, you know, independent publishing gives you a lot more control over your product. You can make every decision. All of the relationships that you have with, like, let's say, an editor or other vendors, like a printer, all of those are up to you. You are the client in those cases. Versus a traditional publisher, they're going to, like I say, they're going to take over more of that creative control. They're going to make certain decisions for you. Maybe it depends a little bit on the size of the press. If they're smaller, they might involve you more in that process. You might have a more direct relationship, but generally speaking, you're going to be a little bit more removed from the material at that stage. The other thing to note is that independent publishing gives you a lot more control over your actual end profits. So it's kind of, it depends, related. It's related to kind of what effort you put in and the market itself. So those things are, you know, it's hard to adjust for the market, obviously, but if you keep plugging away at it, you can do pretty decently. Now, the chance of really, really big, wide commercial success tends to be better on the traditional publishing side, but you also retain less of a ratio of the profits overall. So that's something else to kind of note, just about that. And the other thing is that you kind of mix and match depending on what you want to do. Independent publishing can be a gateway to traditional publishing. Let's say if your book really takes off and somebody contacts you, they want to distribute your manuscript, you still retain those rights to kind of dictate where that goes. Any questions about publication so far? All right. I'm going to get going here. So we're going to get into the meat of actually editing. So what does that involve? Obviously, I mentioned before that editing comes up at various different points in either of the traditional or independent publishing streams, but it can kind of come up in different ways. So either you're going to have more of a direct relationship with an editor, or you're going to be a little bit more removed from them. You might also see them a couple different times or different editors depending on what you're doing. So if you hire an editor before you even, you know, approach a publisher, let's say, you might work with them beforehand, and then you can kind of do something similar when it comes to independent publishing. But what do editors actually do? So I'll kind of zoom out just a little bit. So Editors Canada, I'm a big fan of their professional editing standards. They literally set the standard for Canada when it comes to this profession. So we use our editorial judgment to determine necessary intervention and project scope. So that first one is really important, just to kind of establish what it is we do. We're not looking, you know, old school. I think the idea of an editor is that they're going to come in and they're going to redline everything and they're going to tear you apart, and, you know, they're going to break your heart when it comes to what you've put so much effort in. What an editor does really is make sure that we're determining the best possible changes or suggestions to really strengthen your manuscript. So we want to work with what strength you already have and expand on that, and then find areas that could be brought up to that totally, you know, high standard that you have for other things. So we want to make sure that we're not overriding your voice, we're strengthening it, and we're not there to necessarily try and find out every little tiny thing that we can. We're not going to, most of us, if not all of us, kind of have that mandate to make sure that we're there as a support for you. And if we don't have to intervene, we don't. So we also keep in mind the needs of the audience. I think this is a really good way to frame editing as a profession generally, is that because you as an author, before you kind of distribute your book, you're not really going to have that interaction time with your whole entire audience to be able to kind of see what they like, what they don't like. You can't really, I mean, you can in certain cases, like social media is a really great way to connect with your audience beforehand. But for the entirety of the manuscript, it's a really good thing to have somebody kind of keeping in mind the audience. So you as a writer, and myself, I know this as a writer, is that it's hard when you're so tied to the story or to the book or whatever it happens to be that you are writing. You can't necessarily see everything like an audience would. Editors are trained to do that and to advocate for the audience's needs. So things like access points, accessibility, plain language, making sure that your message is going to reach your audience in the way that you want it to reach them. Other things to note are that we flag potential legal issues, so things like plagiarism, copyright, defamation, all of the things that can be really, really horribly unpleasant to deal with after the fact. We're there to kind of save you that time and that effort and any pain related to those issues. Now, we're not necessarily beholden to doing that, but we do try our best to kind of catch it when we can and when we notice it. We're also similarly there to ensure the integrity and the ethics of the materials are not compromised. Basically, that means we're scanning for bias, we're scanning for stereotypes, inauthentic representations sometimes when it comes to character portrayals, anything that could potentially land you in a little bit more of hot water in that regards. We're there to make sure that what you're saying is coming across the way that you want it to be said. That similarly is kind of taken care of in that conscious language principles as well, and that we communicate clearly with you throughout the process rather, and that we don't introduce any new errors throughout the text. So that's a pretty big mandate. What I want to mention, kind of the flip side of that one, is that authors as well as editors, we're all human, and there are going to be mistakes made. Editors try not to commit any further errors in the text if there are errors, but we also understand, and Editors Canada actually has kind of these acceptable rates of error in the services that you're looking for. So, if you, for example, you flipped open a book on the shelf in the bookstore and you found a typo, we've as editors, our job is to basically correct everything else that would be a lot more egregious than that. Sometimes typos slip through; it happens, but the main thing is that we're there to present it as best as possible. It's not ever going to be perfect, partly because perfect is completely subjective to a lot of people, but it's also something that is kind of that reasonable expectation to set. All right, so after we look at the fundamentals of kind of establishing what editing is as a profession, what do we do? So our actual editing standards, they break down into these 4 groups here. They're the different types of editing that, generally speaking, all editors fall under. There are specializations kind of separate from this or crossing over with this, but the main 4 are here. So I say it's a funnel because if you're familiar with this kind of this process, you start with a really big scope of what you're looking at, and then you funnel down over time. So you start with that really big overarching structural editing, and I'll put the definitions up on the side as well. So structural editing really focuses on things like plot, pacing, the way, so for example, if you're looking at poetry, the way that maybe the stanzas are organized and things like that. You're going to look at cutting material. Basically, this is where you would apply some of the advice, kill your darlings. If you have, let's say a character that needs to be folded into another character, that's the stage at which an editor would say, make those recommendations. So that's the biggest kind of point of view. I like to think of it as kind of an impressionistic painting. You're doing an impression sort of the entire draft. After that, you go into stylistic editing. So this one is further drilled down into that sentence level revision that I think a lot of us think of. It's meant to clarify your meaning, ensure your coherence, and refine the language. You can also play around with your authorial voice at this time. So things like, what does your narrator sound like? What kind of mood are you trying to evoke? Is the atmosphere coming across the way that you want it to? Stylistic editing really kind of touches on all of that stuff. After that, you get into copy editing, which is even finer grain detail. My training has taught me that copy editing is actually not just, word by word, it's actually character by character. So you have to read really, really slowly as an editor to catch all of those mistakes. Those are the times when you're looking for spelling errors, usage issues, so applying, the language that you making sure something means what you think it means, and reviewing all of the consistency and making sure that everything is tidied up. Now, proofreading is there. That's, like I say, if this is a funnel, this is the finest grain detail that you could possibly get to. Proofreading actually refers to reviewing the proof itself. So the actual print materials, or let's say an EPUB format if you're publishing electronically. The intent is to catch any potential errors that could have squeaked through the design and formatting stages. Let's say if something got transposed, if you're missing an entire chapter, that kind of thing is really important to check for after you've gone through the design process, especially if multiple people are actually handling the material. But even when it's one person, you can slip up and you can miss a file, you can, omit something or add something in the wrong place. This is really what that's intended to catch, and any of those last kind of typos and things like that. It's a really important stage, though. So, any questions about sort of editing broadly before I move on? Yes, Jackie.
Yeah, so with all these different stages of editing, how many times would you say that you read the same piece before you are like done with it? Or editors would read the same piece before being done with it?
It's a really good question. So, I mean, I don't know if there was ever an ideal era for the publishing industry for editing as a profession, but the ideal state of being is that different editors are looking at these different things. So, editors, broadly, we tend to specialize in a few different stages, in a few different types of editing. I think most of us are pretty familiar with all of them. But we tend to hone in. So, for example, I really am partial to things like structural editing, stylistic editing. Copy editing is something that I can do and I offer, but it's not necessarily going to be, you know, like I'm drawn to the other ones probably more so. But that said, you can work with the same editor over time. But like the author, we can also get a little bit close to the materials. So it's not our baby, but we kind of treat it like that. And we get invested, we get really pulled into the material, and we can kind of form that attachment to it. So either we need time between, or we need to, hand it off to somebody else. So when I look at a material, if let's say I was doing one type of edit, generally speaking, I bake in two full passes of the material. I might read the material beforehand or kind of skim through it beforehand, but then I'm actually applying those edits on 2 rounds. So I mean, I drill into it based on, the obvious stuff that I can kind of correct along the way, and things that are going to take longer for me to actually address. I highlight those and I kind of go in later. Um, but let's say somebody wanted to, because I think this is more what your question is related to. I'm getting there. Is that if the author is looking to have the same editor look at the material, it depends, I guess, on that process, on what the project entails, what the goals are for the editor or for the author themselves, for the client. If you wanted to do all 4 of those types of edits with one single editor, you might be looking at a pretty big budget for your project. You can combine some of the steps sometimes, like stylistic editing, copy editing. Oftentimes, people will kind of put those together at the same time. But if we're going on the basis that I do two full passes to really be happy with the material before I move on, you're looking at like 8 passes. So if you're doing all 4 with the same person. Now, like I say, that can be, adjusted. It can be looked at. And also it might be faster for me to look at the material once I've seen it a couple times. But there again, that's where I would kind of caution, you get too close to it and you might not see as much as somebody with fresh eyes. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. All right. Anybody else? I can't see the Discord, so I just want to give it a second before I move on. All right. I'm just going to drink some water before I get too far in. All right. Okay. So this next section, I think what we're really interested in here is how to work with editors. So what to actually expect, how to prepare for them, if you are working with one. Not that you need any, lion taming equipment or anything. It just, it just helps to know what you're getting into. So first off, there's a few questions that I like to kind of consider, or that I suggest people consider before they move into that stage. First off, do you actually need an editor? It's a really, really good question to ask before you, like I say, editing is an investment. So, and it depends what you're doing. It can get costly. You want to make sure that you actually need the editor first and foremost. So consider your publishing and audience related goals. If you are looking to reach a really broad audience, if you're self-publishing, I would especially encourage people to look at an editor, because if you're trying to make a career out of it, it makes sense to actually take the time to get those steps just as right as possible. And an editor is really good at helping you through those steps. Writing can be a really isolating experience, I think, unless you are part of a group like this. But at the same time, it really helps to have that sort of that expanded community, somebody in your back pocket who's got your back, who's really close to the material as well. That can really help alleviate a lot of the pressure, along with all the things that editors actually focus on, of course. But on the flip side of that is that if you are doing, let's say a more personal project, if it's something that you're looking to distribute to family and friends, not that they don't warrant, the best quality possible, but it might be, if it's more of a hobby, if you kind of are a little bit more pulled back from the idea of, this is a career, then maybe that's something that you don't necessarily need to consult an editor with. If it's going to be a memento that you're passing on to your descendants, for example, that might be something to look into. So it kind of depends on what your goals are, what your preferences are, and sometimes the level of I feel like the word seriousness is not quite accurate, but I guess we'll go with that seriousness. How committed you are to actually getting that product out and the quality of it that you want to present. The next thing is to get comfortable with positive and constructive critique. And a lot of us think about constructive critique only, I think, when we look at editors or editing or reviewing and workshops and things like that. It's not just constructive or I guess negative, if you want to say negative critique. It's also positive. So I know myself, sometimes I struggle with receiving positive feedback. It makes me horrendously uncomfortable sometimes, and I'm sure that's something that a lot of us can relate to. So you kind of have to get comfortable with the idea that somebody's going to be pointing out what you did really well, as well as areas that you can improve on. So it's kind of that balanced approach. If you think about it like sort of the sandwich method of feedback, a lot of it's sort of oriented that way, but it's something worthwhile to think about. If you're not ready to kind of face that level of critique, especially as intimately as that, then you want to get comfortable with it. You want to take steps to kind of expand on that, and that's where critique workshops, like I think are run by the club here, are really great. So they're a really good opportunity to kind of get out there and get comfortable with receiving that feedback. The next thing is to know the different levels of editing, the different kinds of editing. So, I mean, I'm gonna leave this slideshow as well. I'll give you the deck afterwards. So you can review kind of the definitions broadly there, or you can take a look at Editors Canada. But don't get hung up there as you're moving into looking at an editor. Editors can actually help guide you in this process, and it's a very community-based sort of industry. So if we don't think that we can help you with something, let's say somebody does only memoirs and you're approaching them about something else, they will be able to look at, potentially one of their colleagues that might be better suited for it. Or maybe they do only structural editing. They can kind of recommend somebody for a copy edit. And then we'll also be able to guide you on, let's say you come to us and you're like, I don't know what I need something. Manuscript evaluations are a really good place to start. And a lot of editors, myself included, offer that as kind of a starting point service. And lastly, when you're preparing to work in an editor, it's really important to understand that we all have biases and blind spots. I think that's a really big part of the conversation as writers, that, it's its own conversation that we could get into, although we don't have time for that. But an editor is, again, they're an ally for you. They're there to help you with these things. It's important to remember because this kind of process can be, like I said, it can be intimate. It can make you feel vulnerable. So you want to make sure that you are ready for that, not only ready for it, but you are also picking somebody to work with that is going to be your best suited person for your work and for yourself. So before I move into kind of a little bit more about what the editor's sort of side of things looks like, I will just leave you with a few self and group editing skills. This is really important. Like I say, if you are looking to do a workshop, if you are working with peers, this is stuff that, you know, editors kind of, we live and breathe this. It's part of our profession. So we're already sort of trained in this way, but not everybody is as a writer when you're first approaching this. So what you want to do is start with building trust and delivering supportive feedback. Very oftentimes, you know, I've seen it before where, let's say, a writers group gets very competitive. I don't think that this is necessarily the case for this group from what I've seen, but sometimes it can get that way. It can get a little bit personal. It can feel a little bit like you're being attacked. You want to start from a place of psychological safety. So when I say psychological safety, I mean the feeling that you can actually fully express your opinions and thoughts and that you're not going to be judged for it. That you are able to both receive feedback and that you can put yourself out there, but you can also give feedback in a constructive way that's going to not put people off. You know, listening to the feedback in the first place is a really good place to start. Next is focus on one type of editing at a time. There's a reason we do it in a funnel, and the reason is if you look at copy editing before you look at, let's say, structural edit, all of the words that you're looking at copy editing, that really fine-grained character by character sort of analysis, you're going to rewrite a whole bunch of things potentially in the structural editing stages. So get really specific about the types of feedback that you're requesting as well. If you have critique partners, it's a really good idea to kind of define, okay, this is what I'm looking at. This, you know, do you have any examples that you can share of the type of issues that you're looking for? Or you can say, like, this scene feels a little XYZ, whatever, uncomfortable. It doesn't quite flow as well as I'd like to. And then you can also specify what you're not looking for equally. You can say, I'm not worried about the spelling. You know, if there are errors and stuff like that, you don't have to worry about it. That just saves time. It also means that you're not going to get hung up on those potentially irrelevant details if you're looking at, let's say, something earlier on. Take time between writing and editing. So if you're editing your own work especially, you want to kind of, like I say, even in the editing world, we want to put distance between ourselves and the manuscript. If we've done an edit, we do our first pass and then we kind of put it aside for a little bit, you know, maybe a day or two, and then we come back. Depends on the material, depends on what's needed, and the project timeline, of course. But if you can take that time as a writer, if you're doing your own revisions, put it aside, forget about it, work on something else maybe, and then come back to it with fresh eyes and make sure that you're giving yourself kind of that refresh time on that project. Next is keep organized. So, you know, editors, we have like a ton of tools. We have macros, we have like all kinds of things, programs and spreadsheets aplenty. That really speaks to me as a person. But equally so, it's important to consider at least your organization methods as a writer. You know, for example, if you are looking at a lot of different terminology, a lot of different character names, things like that, a style sheet, what we use in the editing world, it's called a style sheet when you're looking at different names, different spellings of things even. That can be really important to look at. I actually have one up on my website as well if you want to grab it. It can be really helpful for things like fantasy, sci-fi, a lot of the speculative fiction stuff, where things are not necessarily spelled the way that you think, or there are really unique spellings among names and things like that. It's hard to remember. You know, you might miss something, so having a reference on hand is a really good way to kind of speed that process along. The other last thing is to make peace with imperfection. So, like I say, editors are human too, and we never fully expect that a writer is going to get it right. I mean, that's why we're there. Not that we think that you're making a ton of errors in it or anything. We don't go into it thinking that, but we also know that there are ways to kind of tighten a manuscript. There are ways to improve it. But like I say, there is kind of that wall of, you know, you have to be okay with the idea of actually shipping the product at a certain point. A lot of us can get caught up in between those stages. And honestly, an editor is really good at kind of freeing that up for you. You can kind of cross that off your list. You can kind of get that peace of mind before you move on. All right, so I think it was mentioned as well that I wanted to highlight some of the common mistakes that writers make or can make. New writers, writers who've been at it for a while, but these are things to kind of just highlight quickly before we move on. So development and style, like I said, that's kind of my wheelhouse. So I'm going to focus there a little bit more because I think that honestly, these are the kind of mistakes that are the most costly to go back and fix. If you think about it, that funnel is, you're getting finer grain detail over time as an editor or working with an editor. To go back then and do different versions of, a structural edit, for example, or stylistic edit is going to take even more time, and it's going to potentially cost more. Let's say if you were a publisher, you wouldn't want to get stuck in that kind of development, going back and realizing that something is wrong and having to redo a whole bunch of stuff, a whole bunch of work. So that's where I would say to kind of start with is watch for developmented style mistakes, like having an unclear or an unintended message. You want to make sure that your message is honed as a writer, and that you are kind of paying attention to what the implications of what you're saying are. And there again, that's where an editor can help you, or peer feedback can really help you, because we get really close to our characters sometimes and we don't necessarily understand how they're coming across, or even just like, let's say it's a literary analysis. How we're presenting information can mean different things to different people. The other thing is that representation is really important. You want to equally so represent characters and people and subject matter authentically, and do your due diligence. So that means, researching if you don't happen to have the background for the person that you're representing. Talking to somebody with a shared background is really a good way to do that. Consulting with communities is really important as well. The other thing is to rush or drag out pacing. So again, this is one of those things that when you're super close to the material, things don't necessarily feel off to you until you pull back and you kind of give yourself some time to look at it. If a character development seems rushed, other people may pick up on that more than you, but it's something to keep an eye out for as well. So you want to give yourself time to develop, but you also don't want to drag your heels. Overthinking or overworking a piece of writing. There is a point at which your writing will be, there's supposedly an infinite level of edits that you could do on a work. You don't want to overdo it. At the same time, you don't want to overwrite or overthink your material as well. So sometimes you see this, like for example, sometimes writers will try to, let's say, be clever instead of clear. That's a really big example of that I mean. So, I mean, you can use interesting language, but if you're not considering your audience's needs, that is something that's going to potentially harm your message and what you're actually trying to get across. The other last thing that I'll say for development and style is to use narrative devices in an imbalanced way. I'm a big proponent of the idea that there's a balance between the advice that I see out there. Show, don't tell, use active voice and not passive voice, things like that. I've written about and I've talked about, and it's really interesting to see. I think what that advice, it's well intended, because a lot of people might fall into that sort of, let's say, the passive voice category, or into telling rather than showing. It's meant to rebalance that, but I think sometimes people take it too literally, and they don't necessarily realize that passive voice has its own role in writing, and that same thing with showing and telling. Telling is important when the material of what you're talking about is kind of an in-between interstitial, like, sort of scene type of thing. Any questions so far on those mistakes, or anything that I've kind of covered so far? I don't think I stopped for a little bit. Yeah, so Nabneel asked, for those of you who are not in the chat, I think we all are, but I will read it aloud just in case for the recording. So we're not trying to use, so we're just trying to not use narrative devices too extremely. I have a bit of a problem doing this in my work. I guess, what I would say, just on that subject, without getting too into the weeds on it, because it is a big, broad subject, but you want to consider your audience's needs first and foremost before you do anything. Now, I'm not a big fan of, don't worry about this stuff in the first draft. The first draft is for throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. You refine the language afterward. But if you're considering your audience, for example, like, narrative devices, if you use an awful lot of one thing versus another. Show, don't tell, those things can be used interchangeably kind of like throughout the manuscript, and that's probably fine to balance that out that way. But for example, if you have a habit of using a lot of pathetic fallacy, people are going to start to notice. Same as if you use a certain word over and over again. If it's a big word that we don't come across a lot, I just talked about this actually recently, but it's something that is going to stick out to the readers, and you're going to see the puppet strings. I would say that if you feel that your audience is going to see the puppet strings behind what you're doing, and by that I mean they're going to notice your writing. Your writing is conveying a message. I would say that the message and story or whatever thing you're trying to get across is more important overall than the writing. The writing is the vehicle by which we deliver the message. But at the same time, we can also, we can appreciate language, we can appreciate writing for what it is and the ornamentation that it kind of contains. But you kind of want to pull back a little bit. There again, having somebody look at your writing, you might be sensitive to it. You might be thinking that this is a lot, but having somebody else look at it, they can either validate that concern or they can say, it's not something to worry too much about. So I hope that answers your question. If you have any examples of what you mean, I'm happy to cover that as well. But in the interest of time, I will kind of move on to our next part of the discussion. So I'll keep an eye out in the chat as well, or if somebody wants to flag for me. So the next thing that I want to cover is the writing fundamentals. So kind of the almost that invisible work that goes on in writing, or things that we take for granted, things that aren't necessarily the story itself or what we're actually committing to the page. The first mistake might seem obvious, not writing. By nature, writers write. They kind of have to in order to actually be writers. Thinking about writing is it's an area that I think all of us can get stuck in sometimes. And really, it's just one of those things you have to rip off the Band-Aid sometimes and actually get going. I myself can commit that mistake sometimes where it's fun to think about the story and about different ideas bouncing around and not actually commit to actually starting anything, or just to not get in the habit of practicing writing. You want to make sure that you're devoting enough time to that. Alternatively, on the other side of things is burning yourself out with unrealistic targets. So if you say that you want to write like 3,000 words a day, do you have time to do that? Is that realistic for you? Is it something that you actually feel like you can comfortably execute on? And if it is, great, but if it isn't, pull back, look at your goals, and adjust as necessary. So listen to yourself, listen to your body, and also to your social life and your mental health. Your wellness is really important when it comes to writing. Like I say, it can be kind of an isolating experience, which I'm going to talk about as well. But making sure that you're being kind to yourself at the same time with what targets you're setting is really important. And yeah, no worries, Navneil. I'm glad I could do that. Thanks. All right. The next one is lacking any kind of organization or not giving consideration to organization. This one there again, I like organization. I can get kind of hung up on the details there myself. Alternatively, and this might just be because I have ADHD and it swings and roundabouts on that one when it comes to being organized, especially with my own stuff where it's in various different notebooks, things like that. The main thing that I would say is that you don't necessarily have to have a perfect system to match everything, but consider backups as a main sort of point of focus when it comes to organizing yourself. Making sure that you actually have have an eye on where your material is. Do you have backups? Are you going to be crying yourself to sleep when you've lost a 100,000 word manuscript overnight because something happened to your computer? It's a valid question, and it's something that could keep you up at night if that was going to happen. So be kind to yourself in the future and reduce that risk. Pick some way of organizing yourself, which is very helpful. The other thing is obsessing over how your work will be received. This, again, that's where we get into those infinite levels of revisions and things like that. We don't want to share with people sometimes. If your goal is sharing with people, you're going to have to get comfortable with the idea that people are going to have their own interpretations of your work. And that's actually, I think that's a beautiful thing, honestly, without getting too far into that. It's a great feature of, society in general that we all have different opinions. And we can appreciate things differently. And the last one there again is isolating yourself. So obviously, if you're here, if you're part of the club, you're doing a great job of not doing that already. But just remember that there are opportunities out there. There are offers and things like that that people will make to help support you. Myself included, I have a few things at the end that I've got in case you're interested. But, building up your community is really important. And I would say that that is something that sometimes gets overlooked. I think, especially with the traditional idea of writing, it's really important to draw on others for support, to offer support to them equally, and, find your people. So finding your editor, speaking of finding your people, one of those people could be an editor. So like I say, editing is an investment, and taking time to find somebody that suits you and your project is really worth it. Can make or break, kind of your project. I will say editors, literary agents alike, everybody, in the publishing industry, in the support sort of areas, none of them will guarantee a book deal. That's something to watch out for. Just kind of, if somebody is selling themselves that way, that's something a little bit suspect. But the good thing is that working with any one of those people can improve the chances of success for your career overall for your book. And some factors to consider when you're actually looking for that person. So, do you like their communication style? Is it too much, too little, grating, annoying, cloying? Any of those things that wouldn't be good? Or are they answering at just the right time? Are they kind of supporting you? They're there for you, and they're approaching things with that support in mind. Could their background be helpful? So this could apply to education, could apply to identity, and some people like to look for people who are going to understand their source material, or their material rather, I should say, from a more intimate perspective. That's not necessarily always required. I would say if you're specializing in something like medicine, for example, then education background is important. But people also don't always self-identify. So getting to know people and kind of keeping an open mind with that can be helpful, equally as looking for someone like that. And lastly, how would you feel receiving feedback from them? So if you get the opportunity to actually interact with this person beforehand or to see what their style of querying, for example, is, you have an opportunity to kind of evaluate if that style of feedback is right for you. Some people are going to be more to the point, more brunt, or, not brunt, but brash, not brash, something else, different word. Anyway, blunt. Thank you. I don't know what happened there. My brain short circuited. They're going to be more blunt, more direct with their feedback, or somebody else might kind of take a more collaborative approach. For example, it depends what that person looks like. So I always say to try and call or meet with them first. Some editors can be shy. The industry is full of people who are they really like to be behind the computer, which also might be familiar for most writers. I'm weird because I like to meet people. I actually like to chat with people and to get to know them. I shouldn't say weird, but it's something that I like to do, and I always encourage people to do as well. Where and how to look. So just a real brief thing about this. Editorial associations like Editors Canada, and there are a variety of them out there globally, and some that kind of work with Editors Canada, they have directories of their membership a lot of the time. So if you pull up Editors Canada, for example, you'll see this lovely directory, which has a lot of filter options, a lot of things that you can look at, including with distance, for example. So if you did want to potentially meet your editor or the person that you're thinking of hiring, they are really good at filtering that down and seeing where that person is in relation to you. Other things to note are that people in your network might know someone. So, for me as an example, now that you know me, I might know somebody I can recommend. Like I say, it's a very community-based industry. So if, for example, you were to approach me about a project and it doesn't quite fit what I do, what I specialize in, I can usually direct you to somebody else who might be a better fit. All right, I am going to move along quickly because we only have a couple more minutes left here. Just in brief, my editing process. Reach out. So this is just to kind of demystify this process, why I'm spending time here. So reach out. You don't have to have every detail in your head at the start what your project's going to look like, but having some will help. I can help you firm that up in the next step to give you a scope, timeline, quote, really hammer out those details, what you're looking at. After that, it's, you want to make sure that you're signing a contract or at least that there's an agreement of some kind, even if it's, in email. I like to do a full contract just because I think that that's really important to dot your I's, cross your T's, so to speak. And then you send in a deposit. Not everybody has the deposit, but basically it just means that you get that slot in the schedule. Once it comes up, I usually use Microsoft Word. Honestly, their features are really good for this, but there's also other things like PDF track changes or PDF changes, annotation, and Google has a great software for this as well. And then you review your suggestions, anything that I've kind of highlighted for you, you can take a look at, ask for clarification, and then you get your final copy and the final invoice, and that's it. So that's just a general overview of the editing process. Before I get to that, any questions on this one? I just want to give people an opportunity here to ask if need. I mean, we just need to contact editors like you. Yeah. So yeah, basically, for example, if you're looking to hire a freelance editor, then you can specify that directory is a really great tool to look at for what I mean. You can kind of specify, the type of work that you're looking at. So poetry, for example, different genres of things. And I saw you were typing too, so feel free to ask another follow-up if I don't cover this. But basically, yeah. And you can also look at those different levels of editing. So structural editing, stylistic editing, all of those filters are there as well. You can also do an old-fashioned Google search and check to see if there's anybody that kind of fits your criteria. Keywords are really good to search for as well. If you were to reach out to me, for example, like I have a website, a lot of editors have websites or they're listed on directories like that, or both. And you would contact them and see, kind of what work you're looking for. For example, like I said, a manuscript evaluation is a really great place to start if you're not terribly sure. And then, yes, you would contact someone. So it depends, again, what you're looking to do. If you are looking to, let's say, tidy something up before handing it off to like a literary agent or hoping to acquire a literary agent or a publisher, that's a valid step. Alternatively, if you are, if you're doing self-publishing, if you want to make sure that that product is right and, just as good as it can be, then that's when you're reaching out. I hope that answers your question, but please do let me know if there's anything else you had in mind. I'll give you a second to get caught up there. In the meantime, like I say, I have a couple offers just from my own end. And it's a good question you asked about whether you need to pay. That is, oh, perfect. Excellent. Glad I could answer your question. So yeah, I mean, sometimes people offer, have offers and things like that that they can make. For example, one of those for me is a book coaching trial. So I didn't mention book coaching too much here. I don't think I really did at all. But book coaching is kind of like having an editor in your pocket as you're writing something. So it's kind of that developmental stuff. You can bounce ideas off of someone. They kind of help you manage your tasks and your timelines and things like that if you have one that you're trying to stick to, or just help develop your writing practice overall. And that involves reviewing your work a little bit and meeting with the person. And so this is a service that I'm kind of soft launching a little bit. So I'm looking for information and feedback. This is a really great opportunity if you have a project currently in the plotting or initial drafting stages and you're looking for somebody to kind of help you out with that. So I am currently, like I say, I'm doing a trial version of this for feedback specifically. It involves 3 months of free one-on-one developmental coaching, and participants will be asked to provide feedback for market research. Like I say, I want to make sure that what I'm actually putting out there is valuable for people, that it's hitting all of the promises that I'm making, that kind of thing, and to gauge interest as well. So on my website, if you go to my website as well, it's you can mention that code there, or just mention that you knew that that was a thing. The other one is that I am happy to offer pro bono project work. I know that starting out as a writer, it's sometimes difficult to be able to approach an editor, and there's a wide swing in terms of the level of quality, the level like pricing that you're going to be looking out for as well. So this is really good opportunity for budget conscious writers who are curious about working with an editor. I also know that that can be kind of scary to approach an editor, especially if you don't know them. So, I mean, hey, hi, you know me now. And if you have a project that you'd like to approach me with, I will double check, make sure that it kind of fits within what I can safely and properly actually offer you. Um, and I'm happy to do that first project for free. So testimonials are greatly appreciated if you do choose to do that, and it helps me out a lot. Like I say, I'm kind of sort of early days yet in the business. I have a lot of background in it, but it's one of those things that kind of, as a first time freelancer, you kind of run into if you're familiar with that sort of work. Other resources, and I will leave this because I'll post that deck up in the group as well in Discord. So just very briefly, there's a lot of stuff out there. There are a lot of things a writer can kind of access, and start with what you know. Start with the workshops at the Creative Writers Club here at U of T is an excellent opportunity to take. There's other things like associations out there. There's Canadian Authors Association. That's its own membership. Same thing with Editors Canada or Toronto. If you're interested in the editing career, it's a really great place to check out. Or if you just want to learn more about editing or things to even watch out for as a writer. Like I mentioned, I'm actually I'm the programs chair at Editors Toronto, so we run program nights the last Tuesday of every month. I think it's $7 if you're not a member, so it's pretty accessible. And you can kind of learn about a variety of topics. The other things to note are Toronto Public Library always has stuff going on. There is currently the Toronto Star Short Story Contest. Indie Author Conference is coming to Toronto in April as well. If you're interested in that, it's an excellent opportunity to kind of network and see presentations, panel discussions. Word on the street, I believe Editors Toronto is going to be going to that as well, so you might see me there if I'm going, but it's a good opportunity to attend, especially because it's like right around the corner from here as well. And then blogs and social media. So if you're not already doing it, I suggest taking a look at what other writers are out there. Editors are a good resource as well to kind of follow along. You can kind of get an idea of their voice as well if you're doing that. And I've linked my own up there as well. So that is everything I had on the docket, and I only went 7 minutes over. Yay! But in the meantime, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer those as well, so long as they don't kick us out.
No worries. As any questions are being typed, I'm just going to go over some little finalizing announcements. First of all, thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to.
Round of applause. As you hinted at multiple times, we are going to be starting up writing workshops. So we will be sharing our own work, editing them among ourselves. This gives you a chance to experience the process of editing, both editing yourself and having your work edited. It is among the club, among friends. We're all going to be nice to each other. I moderate, so I'm going to make sure everybody's nice to each other, or else they get in trouble. I think it's a great way to get started because I think there's a lot of fear going into editing that might be alleviated if you know, hey, it's my buddy talking to me. You know, like they're going to say that they like this, or they like this, or maybe this needs to be changed. You know, we're all going to be nice. I also wanted to flag the Fantasy World Building Workshop, which is happening February 2nd at 2 to 4 p.m. at UC room 256. That's up on our Instagram. It will be posted to our Discord. We will also be posting the announcement for the workshop schedule onto our Discord. That is coming. The marketing person who was on that is sick, so she's a little bit behind. That's okay. We want her to feel better first. And this whole talk was recorded, and it will be posted to our YouTube channel. Not a lot of people know we have that. We do. That should be up later tonight. Before I go to sleep, it'll be up. So maybe early into tomorrow morning, technically. If there's no more questions, there are people right outside the door.
Oh dear. Okay, yeah. We should probably give them the space here.